The office of Summit Tech Corp was quiet that morning. The hum of computers and faint clatter of keyboards filling the sleek, glass-walled space. Richard Kane, a man known for his decisive demeanor and razor-sharp business instincts, sat behind his mahogany desk reviewing quarterly reports. The sunlight streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows, casting long shadows across the polished floor. But the calm of his usual routine was shattered in an instant. A small shuffling sound came from the doorway. Richard looked up, expecting a junior assistant or intern. But froze, there stood a little girl. No older than 7, her blonde hair messy, her school uniform wrinkled and dusty, her eyes white and glistening with tears. Locked onto his, and she spoke in a voice so fragile that it seemed impossible for anyone to hear. "Sir, my mom didn't wake up." The words hit him like a punch to the chest. The meticulous, calculated world of boardrooms, investments and mergers dissolved instantly, leaving only raw human urgency. He could see the fear etched into her tiny face, the way her hands clutched the straps of a small, worn backpack as if it were a lifeline. Richard rose slowly, his mind racing. The office, so often a place of strategy and negotiations, now felt alien, cold, and insufficient. "Show me now," he whispered, barely audible, his voice betraying the tension he rarely allowed anyone to see. The girl nodded and turned, her small figure leading him through. The echoing corridors of the office building, Richard followed, his polished shoes clicking sharply against the marble floor. Each step measured yet desperate, they exited the building. Stepping into the crisp air of a San Francisco morning, the city was alive around them, cars honking, cyclists weaving through traffic, and pedestrians rushing to work. But he noticed none of it. His focus was entirely on the child and the mother she led him to. They reached a modest apartment building. Tucked between towering glass skyscrapers, the girl fumbled with keys. Her small hands shaking, Richard could feel the urgency growing. The helplessness that made him, a man accustomed to control, suddenly vulnerable. The door creaked open, and the apartment smelled faintly of cold milk and stale coffee. An ordinary home frozen in an extraordinary moment. There she was, the mother, lying on the floor, motionless. Richard's trained eyes quickly assessed the situation. There was no dramatic scene. No blood, no obvious injuries. Just a woman pale and still. A small child hovering in panic above her. Richard knelt beside her, gently checking for a pulse, feeling for any signs of life. The tiny heartbeat, he found, was faint, irregular yet undeniably present. He looked up at the girl, trying to anchor her panic. "It's okay, you did the right thing by coming for help. We'll take care of her," he said, his voice calm but urgent. In that moment, the CEO of Summit Tech, the man who could command millions in the boardroom, became simply a man who would do everything in his power to save a life. Outside, the city carried on, oblivious to the quiet crisis unfolding in a small apartment. Tucked into its heart and inside, a bond formed between a terrified little girl and a man who realized that sometimes human life mattered far more than profit, prestige, or power. The wail of sirens cut through the crisp San Francisco morning. As the ambulance screeched to a halt outside the small apartment building, Richard Kane, normally the composed CEO of Summit Tech Corp., felt a chill run down his spine. The little girl clung to him instinctively, her tiny hands gripping his suit jacket, as if it were a shield against the unknown. "It's going to be okay," he whispered, not to himself, but to her, repeating the words like a mantra that he needed as much as she did. Paramedics rushed past him, their practiced efficiency, a stark contrast to the chaos of his thoughts. They assessed the mother immediately, checking her pulse vitals and consciousness. Richard stepped back just slightly, giving them space but staying close enough to comfort the girl. He noticed the shallow rise of the mother's chest, barely perceptible, and a shiver ran through him. Her skin was pale, almost icy, and he instinctively wrapped his jacket around her shoulders. The little girl's sobs broke the tense silence. "Will she be okay?" she asked, voice trembling. Richard knelt beside her, taking her small hands in his. "She's strong," he said, "and we're going to help her. You did the right thing by calling for help. You were brave." The girl's eyes, still filled with fear, flickered with a spark of hope inside the ambulance. The confined space heightened the intensity of every moment. Richard stayed by the mother's side, holding her hand lightly, watching the monitors track her vital signs. The paramedics worked seamlessly, inserting IV lines, checking oxygen levels and securing her for transport. Every beep of the monitor and every hurried instruction from the paramedics was amplified in his ears. He felt helpless, stripped of the control he wielded daily in boardrooms. Presentations and negotiations, here there were no PowerPoints, no contracts, just life and its fragile uncertainty. Through the ambulance window, the city blurred into streaks of gray and gold. Richard's mind raced, recalling the families he had, the employees who relied on him, and the sudden realization that life could change in an instant. His hand never left the mother's, a silent promise that he would not let her slip away. He whispered reassurances to both mother and daughter, hoping his calmness would transfer to them. Finally, the hospital came into view, its bright lights cutting through the foggy morning. Paramedics wheeled the stretcher through the automatic doors, while Richard stayed close, guiding the little girl who struggled to keep up with her tiny legs. The emergency room was a flurry of activity nurses, doctors' machines, but Richard remained focused, a steady presence amidst the controlled chaos. When the mother was finally in the hands of the emergency team, stabilized for immediate care, Richard knelt beside the little girl once more. "You were amazing today," he said gently. "You saved your mom by asking for help. That's something no one can ever take away from you." Her tear-streaked face lit up with a small, grateful smile. And for the first time since the morning began, he allowed himself to breathe, though the tension in his chest hadn't fully released. In that moment, he realized something profound. Power in the boardroom was nothing compared to the power of compassion, presence and courage when life hung in the balance. And as he watched the little girl cling to her mother, Richard understood that sometimes the most important things a person could do had nothing to do with business. The hospital waiting room was cold and sterile, the fluorescent lights casting a harsh glare on the plastic chairs. Richard Kane, usually the decisive CEO of Summit Tech Corp., sat quietly, his hands folded in his lap, eyes fixed on the double doors leading to the emergency ward. The little girl sat beside him, her small frame trembling, but she clutched a stuffed rabbit tightly, a small comfort in the midst of fear. He kept glancing at her silently, reassuring her with his calm presence, even though his own anxiety churned beneath the surface. Minutes felt like hours. Every passing step in the hallway, every muffled voice of doctors and nurses, sent a shiver through the little girl. Richard held her hand gently. "Your mom is strong," he said softly. "The doctors are taking care of her. She's going to be okay?" She nodded, but didn't speak, her eyes fixed on the floor, lost in worry eventually. A nurse emerged, her face kind but professional. "She's stable," the nurse said. "Critical? Yes. But she's alive and breathing steadily. She'll need to stay under observation for a while, but she's going to make it." Relief washed over the little girl. In a flood of tears, she threw herself into her mother's arms. As soon as she was allowed to see her, Richard stayed in the background, quietly watching the reunion, feeling a rare mixture of pride and humility at the courage both mother and daughter had shown. Richard noticed the mother weakly smile up at her daughter, whispering words of gratitude and love. The little girl, once terrified and uncertain, now exuded a quiet resilience. He realized then that bravery came in many forms, not always measured in boardroom victories or bold business deals, but in the simple act of calling for help, trusting someone to answer, and standing firm even when fear threatened to take over. After a while, he approached the mother and daughter cautiously. "I'm glad she's okay," he said quietly. His words were sincere, stripped of the usual formality or power he wielded in his business life. The mother looked up at him with a grateful, exhausted smile. "Thank you for everything," she whispered. Richard merely nodded, his presence saying more than words ever could. That night, as Richard returned to his office at Summit Tech, the city lights twinkling across the bay, he reflected on the day's events. The skyscrapers and neon signs that usually symbolized opportunity and power now seemed distant, almost trivial compared to the life he had helped protect. For the first time in a long while, he understood that influence and wealth were meaningless if they weren't paired with compassion and human connection. The little girl's courage, the mother's fragility, and the silent trust she had placed in him left a permanent mark on him. It was a story that no contract, board meeting, or shareholder report could ever capture, a story that reminded him of the fragile, fleeting nature of life and the weight of responsibility we all carry for one another. As he gazed out over the city that evening, Richard Kane understood something deeply. Some victories aren't measured in money or power. They're measured in lives saved, hope restored, and trust honored. And today he had witnessed all three in the quiet bond between a terrified little girl and a mother who survived because someone chose to care.